In this session, Mark Sainsbury explores Donald Davidson's views about how theories of truth can be used as theories of meaning. The discussion follows on from the Siegel discussion in this series. Where Siegel concentrates on the aims of giving a theory of meaning for a language, Sainsbury examines Davidson's thoughts about how such a theory is to be constructed. The interview opens with some remarks about the relation between truth and meaning. Davidson explains why he thinks that truth is a much clearer notion than meaning, and he defends Tarski against allegations that he presumed an understanding of the notion of meaning in giving an explanation of the notion of truth. Sainsbury next presses Davidson on why he thinks that theories of meaning must use the notion of truth. Davidson requires that a theory of meaning be first compositional, that is, that it show the meanings of the sentence systematically depend on the meanings of their constituent parts, and that it be tested at the level of sentences and not at the level of words. Now, given these requirements, Sainsbury asks, why would Davidson not accept a theory which had theorems of the form S means that P, instead of his own preferred S is true if and only if P? Davidson's answer is that such a theory, because it used the notion of meaning, wouldn't be sufficiently explanatory, and he states that one of his major aims is to explain how it is that we can understand language without assuming in advance that we understand intensional notions like proposition, meaning, or synonymy. There follows a discussion of Davidson's paper, A Nice Derangement of Epitaphs, in which Sainsbury asks Davidson to respond to the claim that what he says in this paper leaves no room for theories of meaning as theories which suffice for interpretation. Davidson explains the point he was trying to make in the paper, but he concedes to Sainsbury's suggestions, agreeing that a theory of meaning should be taken to be something which, together with contextual features and general knowledge, suffices for interpretation. The final section of the interview consists of a detailed discussion of John Foster's objection to Davidson's view that theories of meaning should take the form of Tarski-style truth theories, and of what Davidson has said in reply to Foster's criticisms. The interview closes with some remarks about how Davidson differs from Frege in thinking that natural language is not some fixed phenomenon that speakers come to grasp, but rather that it is dynamic. As speakers' beliefs change, so too do their languages. We now join the discussion at the London School of Economics. I'm delighted to introduce my next discussant, Mark Sainsbury, Professor of Philosophy at King's College, University of London. And Mark will discuss with Professor Davidson Tarski's truth theory, or sketch out a bit of Tarski's truth theory, and Davidson's use of Tarski's theory to ground a theory of meaning. Mark.
The view that meanings are truth conditions, or that meanings can be described in terms of truth conditions, is said to go back to Frege, and it's certainly in Wittgenstein's Tractatus. But in some ways, the notion never really did all that much work, or at least in my view, until you added certain components to the story, which I think were crucial, and as a result of which this thought, this connection between meaning and truth conditions, has really set the agenda in philosophy of language for many of us in the last 20 or more years. And the two additional components were the use of the kind of theory that you drew from Tarski's work. And the other component was radical interpretation, which turned out to have immensely rich consequences for all sorts of problems in philosophy of mind and indeed in metaphysics. What I want to ask you about today were various questions, some of them you've responded to already in print, some of them you haven't, about how you view this relation between truth and meaning. You say that you can use the notion of truth to throw light on the notion of meaning, but you want to stress that this is location of concepts, it's not reduction. So the first question I wanted to ask was whether you think that the light can travel in the other direction as well. Actually, at one time you characterized Tarski as having used the notion of meaning, more precise the notion of translation, to throw light on the notion of truth. But I just wondered whether you felt that this was a case where the light traveled just one way, from truth to meaning, or whether there's any reciprocal light that you could throw on the notion of truth that emerged from the notion of meaning.
The notion of meaning is an extremely elusive notion, and the attempt to have a clear idea of what the meaning of a word or sentence is has never been stated in such a clear way that you could say that you know exactly how to tell that, let's say, two sentences have the same meaning, or that two words have the same meaning. It's not as though when we look in dictionaries, we don't find, in some cases, what we consider to be more or less good synonyms. There are some cases where they are, and some cases where we see that the dictionary hasn't produced synonyms, but it's produced a good enough hint so that it's a help in understanding a word we didn't know before. The appeal to the notion of truth for me was not aimed to find a substitute for the notion of meaning. It was rather to try to find a way of talking about linguistic communication, understanding what people are up to when they talk, a way of doing that without putting any weight on a notion of meaning as if we understood that already. So there's a sense in which my idea was to show what you could do without the notion of meaning, and then you could say, haven't we now done what one was trying to do by talking about meanings without putting any weight on that notion, as if it were independently understood to begin with. So that's why I've been stating one of my aims as just stating, if possible, what it is that a competent interpreter or speaker knows that allows them to be understood by somebody else or allows them to understand somebody else. And then I said, well, now if we know that, is there something that's left out that the notion of meaning would bring in? Or is that actually telling us what it was that we were interested in to begin with? So it's not as though I think, well, here are these two notions, meaning and truth. We understand them both. Let's see how they're related to each other. It's rather, I think, the notion of truth is relatively clear. Relatively, I mean, it's up to a point anyway, relatively clear, at least by comparison with the notion of meaning. So if we can start with that and arrive at a satisfactory answer to the question, what does somebody know who understands a speaker or who hopes to be understood, then we see how to look at the problems we were discussing when we used the notion of meaning, but without using that notion. It's not that there's something wrong with the word meaning. It's as though we're trying to circumvent the puzzles that we felt when we talked about the meaning of something, as if that were some special entity which we could grasp.
So do you think that there was something misguided about Tarski's attempt in that case? Because he did take the notion of translation for granted, that was important in his specification of convention T, which provided an adequacy condition for the kinds of formal theories he was trying to construct. So was he, would it be right then to say that he was using a rather obscure notion in an attempt to define or explain a really rather clearer notion, namely that of truth?
Well, the notion of translation doesn't enter into his formal work at all.
Sure.
It's only part of an attempt to give people, well, actually, it's part of the attempt to make it clear that that what it is that he is defining for a particular language is what we all understand by the notion of truth. And to the extent that one accepts, without having to analyze it, the notion of translation, one will see that his definitions of truth for particular languages are definitions of a concept we have, namely the notion of truth. Of course, all that's required actually for the definition to come out right would be that the translations are truth-preserving.
Yeah.
So it's not as though there's a heavy dependence
Right.
on the notion of sameness of meaning.
Right. Okay, well, shall we look more closely in the detailed way in which you think that truth can throw light on the nature of meaning? So the project, I understand it, is this. You consider theories of meaning for specific languages, and you ask the question, how should such a theory be constructed? How should it be supported? How should it be justified? And your famous view is that the answer to the question, what form should these theories take, is they should take the form of truth theories. Now, I know that you've got plenty of reasons against, instead, thinking of these specific theories as theories which deliver theorems of the form S means that to be. So I know you have a number of reasons for not thinking that that's the form that the specific theories of meaning should take. But I wanted to ask you something quite particular about this, namely whether among those reasons you would count the threat of circularity. I mean, do you feel that the project would be undermined by circularity if, after considering how a theory of meaning for a specific language should be constructed, we came up with, as at any rate, a kind of ideal that it should deliver theorems of the form S means that be? Would that reuse of the notion of meaning at that level be impugned by the thought that there's something circular here?
Well, if the suggestion is simply that having constructed a theory of truth, we then substitute for the words is true if and only if the word means, the phrase means that, then of course we would just be suggesting that we used a different set of words than we did before. The structure of the theory would be untouched. But circularity,
it's more radical.
Circularity wouldn't be in the picture. It would rather be that our understanding of the words means that there would be completely dependent on our understanding of the word true.
Okay, I actually had in mind the rather more radical suggestion, not that you should start with a theory of truth and then just append means that at the end, but that you should start with axioms like Hesperus. The word Hesperus means Hesperus, and the word white means the property of being white, for example. I mean, obviously, there are going to be plenty of problems about how you actually implement this project. And I'm not wishing to claim that it can be implemented, But what I wondered was whether, in your view, it would be correct to say, don't even think about that, because you're just reusing the notion of meaning, which is what I'm trying to cast light on. Would that be your response?
Oh, I think I need to see the construction, and since I have only a very primitive idea of how it might try to proceed, and that way leads to almost instant disaster. I'm not sure what the counterfactual is I'm trying to evaluate.
Well, perhaps it'd be easier if I just told you why I was asking the question, because
good.
The motivation will.
Good.
It seems to me it seems to me that your account of matters uses the notion of truth in more than one place, and for me personally, the illuminating use of the notion of truth has been in your account of radical interpretation, in particular your account of what sort of evidence for a theory of meaning one should look to, and then how you might, once you've constructed the theory, how you might justify the theory in terms of understanding, a general understanding of the behavior of the speakers in terms of their beliefs and desires. And for the theorist, truth figures crucially in both those matters on your account, and I find that very important and suggestive. However, the fact that truth figures in these places doesn't immediately entail, or doesn't have any logical connection indeed, with the question of whether truth features in the systematic theory which the theorist uses in order to report his results. And it could well be true that the evidence uses the notion of truth, the holding true or preferring true, that testing the theory uses the notion of truth, because in making sense of somebody you need to know whether they're forming beliefs that's true relative to the sorts of things impinging on them and so on. So you need truth in both those places, but that doesn't entail that truth is the right concept to use in the formal specification of the theory for which you're seeking evidence and which you're seeking to check.
Here's what I sense as being one of the basic difficulties in constructing a theory of meaning from the start, and that is this. One of the essential attributes of a theory of truth is that it is tested just at the level of sentences. As truth is a property of sentences, or better still, of utterances. And those are the things that we actually use in communication. We don't use words in communication except as we think of them as embedded in a sentence. Often one word will do it because we think of it as standing for a sentence. But those are the things that we use. Now, any testing of the correctness of a theory of meaning or a theory of truth, whatever we call it, will have to test it at the level where our beliefs and our desires show themselves in what we want to say. And those are sentences. Now the trouble with, and let's say in pursuing a theory of truth along the lines that, general lines that Tarski showed us how to pursue it, we pick out parts of sentences and assign them semantic roles only insofar as that serves to give us a finite theory about all the sentences. So it's not as though we have to independently test what it says about words which are not sentences. We test what we've said about words only in how well it accounts for how sentences work. Now, I don't even dream of how a theory of meaning would operate. Is it going to start with sentences and then extract meanings of words? But to start out with direct evidence of what a sentence means is going to require that we be able to individuate the contents of sentences right from the start. But that does seem to me would absolutely beg the question that we're interested in. The question is, how do we do that? And I see at least an advance in a theory of truth on that question, because what we take as evidence is just that people use the sentence in certain situations, right? And it's not an accident that the notion of truth turns up both in our characterizing the evidence and in our formal theory. What we're trying to do, of course, is detect from the sentences that somebody holds true in certain circumstances an answer to the question, under what circumstances are those sentences true? Right? So it's not as though there's an accidental connection between what we want to find out and the kind of evidence that we're using.
But what if somebody said at that point, against the background of a meaning theory which was just as compositional, as did just as much just as compositionality as a truth theory, was just as much tested by at the sentence level rather than at the word level. But we're at the point where you imagined your theorist saying, well, this is a little part of the pattern of holding true, and what we want to do is to devise a theory which will explain why people should hold true this sentence in terms of it being true under the conditions in question. Mm-hmm. Why shouldn't instead at that point a theorist say something like this? Well, we're trying to devise a theory which will assign a meaning to every sentence by a theorem of the form S means that P. Here's a little bit of the pattern of how the sentences are held true in the community. And of course, all other things being equal, or as a starting hypothesis, we'll want to assign them a meaning such that these sentences are indeed true under the conditions in which the speakers are operating. So here it seems that we have to, the thought was that this theorist has taken on board a lot of lessons that, from you, that the theory has to be compositional and it's going to be tested by its output, and there's going to be no direct test of the axioms that are dealing with the words. But it isn't a theory that whose content is, in the first instance, about truth. It's a theory whose content is about meaning. This entails something about truth, and that's how it can use truth-related evidence for the theory. So really what I'm trying to press you again on is the point, your words were, it's no accident that truth appears both in the evidence and in the theory, but here's a theory, namely a means that theory, which uses truth-related evidence, but is actually offering a richer content in the theory. So I guess my original question was, would you object to that on ground of circularity? But it would be best to ask now, would you object to that for any reason?
I think I'm having a difficulty, which is just due to the fact that I don't know what this theory is going to look like or how it's going to work. So whether it's circular or not, I don't know. But let me give an example from the work of Grice and people who have followed him, who have tried to at least suggest how you could define the notion of meaning on the basis of the notion of intention. That is start out with something that intention already individuates sentences or thoughts in exactly the same way, whatever that is, that we individuate meanings. I mean, if I have two different intentions, then I will express them by using sentences that have different meanings. So here would be an example where we get the basis for our theory of meaning on the basis of from something that is individuated by assumption in just exactly as fine a way as we need for meanings. Now, I would say that's not exactly circular, but it's not the kind of, it doesn't go down to the level of understanding that I would like to achieve. I don't think it's very hard if you're able to, if you assume that you can individuate a person's beliefs in the sense that two beliefs are different, if sentences that are not synonymous would be called for, or where you'd express the same belief only by using synonymous sentences, then I'd say, well, we're just we're supposing that our basic problem is already solved, which is how do we get to the contents of the things that people are saying from outside? That is, without assuming we already can individuate their thoughts or their intentions in advance, somehow independently of being able to talk to them. Then we say, well, on the basis of that, I say, well, it's obvious that if you knew all about a person's intentions, you would know what they meant by what they say, because among their intentions are the intention to be understood in a certain way. So the notion of meaning is just already in the notion of intention. So it's not, notice, there's nothing wrong with explaining the relations between the notion of intention and the notion of meaning. It's just that it doesn't get at the kind of problem that I'm interested in, and that I think people typically have been interested in when they wanted to understand what makes communication possible. What is it for an utterance to mean something? Mean what it does mean. There's a sense in which you would have started too high up or assuming too much. So that's what I suspect in your theory of meaning that starts, so to speak, as a theory of meaning right from the beginning, that we're going to have to assume we already can individuate something along the lines of propositions. And a large part of the point of my project is not to depend upon that sort of thing, but try to get results that satisfy what we were talking about when we did talk that way, but without using, that is, resting, putting weight on notions like proposition, meaning, synonymy, and so forth, as if we understood them in advance.
Well, perhaps I could take you up on the notion of communication that is the focus of what you think of really as what's to be explained.
Right.
And I wanted to ask you about that lovely article. I think it's terrific, a nice derangement of epitaphs. It's funny and also very suggestive. But for many people, I think I'm not alone in thinking that it's slightly hard to locate the considerations you advance there within the sort of overall drift of your work, because there you argue that when people who are trying to communicate come together, they do so with what we call a prior theory. Each has a prior theory that he brings to bear, but that this prior theory won't, at least typically, won't be enough to enable him to interpret his interlocutor. It therefore doesn't satisfy the condition for being a theory of meaning, because theory of meaning is specified by you as something knowledge which would suffice for interpretation. So the prior theory can't be a theory of meaning. And then you point out what happens when we actually get going is that we elaborate and, if necessary, change and unpick various parts of the prior theory to construct a different theory, which is the passing theory. And this is enough for interpretation, but it's ephemeral. And in that respect, at any rate, there wouldn't be a theory of meaning at any rate for English, because the passing theory is just past, and English is meant to go on. So the feeling that many readers of that article have is that you've just left no room for the theory of meaning, the notion of which was a crucial ingredient in the formulation of your original program. So I wonder if you could say how you see that work fitting together.
Yes, you're certainly right that that's puzzled many people, and it may be that I have to modify the way I put some things in order to accommodate that. The first thing to say, I think, is a theory of meaning in the style of Tarski, which I've discussed, is a story about how we can get into a person's states of mind from outside in an imagined situation where we don't have any head start. And so we're just trying to get the hang of it, and we do as well as we can on the assumption that pretty much people are going to go on as before. That is, use the same sounds in the same ways, that is, with the same connections with their behavior and with the world that they did before. If we couldn't assume that, we would never catch on to what was going on. The point of the nice derangement of epitaphs was, once we have a going theory of that sort, we're in the swim. Then we can accommodate all sorts of things for which we had no specific preparation. And there are a lot of different phenomena. Some of them are just, no two people speak exactly the same way. So of course we weren't prepared exactly to understand them. So we didn't have a fully formed, a complete theory for them. We had a general theory which we were prepared to modify on the spot. It's not, and if you ask, how do we do that? Then I think no theory of language is going to tell us, because we use everything we've got. Our sense of humor, our experience of the kinds of mistakes people are apt to make, what is going to come out as a slip of the tongue rather than anything else, something that we're inclined to call a malapropism. We don't know what's going to happen, but because we've got a lot of background, and some of that background is linguistic, that is, we expect a lot of things, and only so many of them could be disappointed, and we'd still understand. And different people are better than others. Most parents can understand their very young children when other people can't, and they've made their adjustments. Now, why was I interested in this, because I was trying to discredit the idea that there are norms of language to which we ought to adhere, not just in order to be understood, but because there is a norm sitting there in society, in the social habits that people have, and we ought to pay attention to that. Now I was saying, no, I don't see why we should, as long as we're understood. That's what counts, and we have lots of ways of making ourselves understood or just being understood that don't depend at all upon adhering to the norms. Of course, if by a norm you mean something like an average, that's not something we have an obligation to. We're just contributing to the average. Nobody has any obligation to be average. So it's the notion that there is some kind of an obligation to the social manner that is independent of simply the desire to be understood, or perhaps the desire to be thought to have gone to a good school, or the desire to please one's teachers. I mean, those are all intelligible desires, but they have nothing directly to do with communication.
Isn't there something though to the thought that when a politician says, "I rebut these charges," full stop, I hereby rebut them, meaning then he's spoken correctly and that's right. But when he says, "I hereby refute them," he can't have said anything that's correct, and he's infringed the norm of language. There must be some residual room for that contrast in any account.
Well, it's a good thing to preserve old distinctions in some cases. That doesn't present a freestanding obligation. It's an obligation, it just means if we want to preserve those distinctions, then we ought to do this rather than that. And many of us want to preserve some of those distinctions.
And ought to want to? Or?
No, I don't say that we ought to. Perhaps it's true that we ought to, but that's not a freestanding obligation. That's depending upon other things, such as life will be merrier, or understanding will be promoted. Those are genuine aims, and they're good ones. But the aims are contingent on wanting to be understood or promote understanding quite generally, or something like that. Those are perfectly good aims. But it's not as though the language itself, or even how other people speak, is in itself creating any obligation.
Yeah, I wonder if people have perhaps confused the obligation that you have if you enter into discourse to be as clear as you can, or to be as helpful as you can. I wonder if they've confused that with something that springs from the nature of language itself.
Well, that would be the kind of thing that I would say, yes.
Yeah. Is there any room on this view for the thought that language is conventional?
Well, if one means by conventional that, of course, what sounds we use to convey what thoughts is to some extent arbitrary. That is, we could have used other sounds, other people in other countries and other cultures do use other sounds, then it's conventional. But if if it means more than that, then I would say no. I think the use of the word convention has done a lot of harm
Right.
in the discussion of language.
Right. Well, can we just go back now, because I didn't feel I entirely followed the answer to the question about whether you in your nice derangement mode think there's room for a theory of meaning as you understood it in earlier writings. Because you said that any serious account of what actually goes on in communication involves the use of skills which simply can't be counted as linguistic. So another way to put the question would be, won't the kinds of considerations you bring to bear in that article make one wonder whether there are any language-specific skills at all points we're needing to use our sense of humour, our judgment about what's likely and so on, whenever we're engaged in interpretation. And mightn't this, well, at least if not eliminate any skills that could be called distinctively linguistic? Perhaps the way to put it would be this: wouldn't it be a consequence of your view in that article that the linguistic skills won't actually be sufficient for interpretation?
Yes, good. I think that's right. In fact, I think in that article, Nice Derangement of Epitaphs, I said, not only have many people been wrong in supposing that there are languages in a certain philosophical sense of language, but furthermore, I've been guilty of saying this too, and I think that's right. In fact, of course, something like the simple application of the expectations of regularities is still operating in our normal conversation in a huge way. I mean, if all of our expectations about what people were going to mean by what they said were frustrated, we simply wouldn't understand anything. So the deviations have to be rather special. But the question, how do we interpret those deviations, I think, obviously can't call on just the kind of evidence that I was saying sufficed to build up the original theory, because that depended upon having heard people use these very words in situations of which you could connect it with the world and with their further actions. And here, all of a sudden, you get surprises. So that kind of evidence is lacking up to this moment. I mean, one could strain, I suppose, and say, well, now you've got some new evidence, so you arrive at a new theory on the spur of the moment. That is actually how I did put it there. So there's not a straight contradiction between these things, but there certainly is a strain set up there, and I think it's right to say, in understanding somebody, even just the literal meanings of their words, we in fact call on, or we may call on almost anything we know, and in fact need to call on more than we can learn by the rather simple-minded methods that were outlined in radical interpretation and such places. I think that's right. It's not as though the other part's wrong. It has to play an absolutely basic role. But once it's played that role, then further things can happen with surprising ease.
So one way to put it would be that a theory of meanings isn't something that suffices for interpretation, but we can nonetheless delimit what the theory of meaning has to do. It has to produce something which, together with contextual features and general knowledge, will suffice for interpretation or something of that kind.
Well,
unhappy with that.
Yes, yes, and I think basically that's right, and the only way in which I partly circumvented that was to say, no, you always have a theory to the extent that you understand the person, but the theory may be one that you cooked up right
on the spot
now.
Right. Mm-hmm. But wasn't there another, or have I misremembered this? I thought there was another somewhat subversive suggestion in that article, which was this, that for any given what we intuitively call a language, there might be more than one rather different thing which met this revised account of what it is to be a theory of meaning, namely something which provided all the linguistic materials for interpretation, and then needed, in every case, supplementation with general cognitive abilities. Do you think that this theory of meaning will be common to speakers of what we intuitively classify as a single language? So do you think my prior theory, my theory of meaning in this restricted sense, will coincide with yours? Really, isn't it? So that there still will be a robust conception of a single language, a single shared language.
Well, robust perhaps, but certainly not sharp. I don't suppose that any two of us have exactly the same expectations with respect to speakers. I mean, as to what they will mean if they say so-and-so. We may have so nearly the same expectations with respect to most of the things that get said that there's no practical point in stressing the fact that there must be differences also. Mm-hmm. So it's a matter of degree. I think of all communication, all understanding of other people is a matter of degree. We never have got everything exactly right, but we get it right enough sometimes. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we don't.
Right, sure. Well, can we, as it were, draw breath now and move away from these rather general considerations about what sort of thing a theory of meaning should be, and look in a bit more detail at your proposal, which is that they're proposals about the evidence of the theory and how you test the theory, but your proposal that the form of the theory should be a Tarski style truth theory. And one of the familiar problems that that proposal encounters is that you can have a true Tarski style truth theory for a language which has T sentences which aren't interpretive, they aren't usable for interpretation. And this is a problem that I think came to its sharpest form in the article by John Foster, to which you replied. And in that reply, you made a concession, it seemed to me rather a major concession, and I think what I'd like to know is really how you stand on this issue now. I think I'll be able to find your earlier words. Nothing strictly constitutes a theory of meaning. A theory of truth, no matter how well selected, is not a theory of meaning, while the statement that a translational theory entails certain facts is not, because of the irreducibly indexical elements in the sentences that express it, a theory in the formal sense. I didn't read that quite right, but the statement that a translational theory entails certain facts is not a theory in the formal sense because of it containing indexical features. So it looks as if you're saying there that there aren't any theories of meaning, and that again disturbs people who are enthusiastic for your project, because it removes one of, as the nice derangement seemed to threaten to do, because it removed this crucial tool around which everything centered, the notion of radical interpretation and principles of charity and humanity centered, namely the notion of a theory of meaning. So I wonder what your current view was on that. Do you regard Foster's point as one which shows that, strictly speaking, there isn't a theory of meaning, something which is both a Tarski-style truth theory and something sufficient for interpretation.
Unfortunately, I don't have the essay in front of me, and so I don't have the context in which I said that, and I'm not sure what the point of it was. I mean, in fact, I don't know what the point of it was.
Should I say, I'm sorry to interrupt,
Yes.
should I perhaps just do a bit of, because maybe of general utility?
No, please do. If you can tell me the context, please go.
Fine. So, well, Foster's idea was that if you look at the content of a truth theory, it's not going to be strong enough. So that what you have to do is it's not going to be strong enough because you're going to get truths like the sentence "snow is white" is true if no news snow is white, and either it's raining or it isn't. That was one kind of case. As you said then, there's more than one kind of case, and we might actually explore the different impacts of the different kinds of case. But leaving that on one side for a moment, his point was that simply knowing a truth theory, however, even if it happens, in fact, to be one which delivers none but interpretive T-sentences, unless you know that it delivers none but interpretive T-sentences, you're not in a position to use it to interpret the speakers, because when you interpret, you need to end up with knowledge. So if you don't know that what you're using is an interpretive, or translational was the terminology current then, if you don't know that it's translational T-theory, then you don't know enough to interpret the speakers. So what Foster then envisaged was that what you really meant was not that knowledge of the T-theory itself is sufficient for interpretation, but knowledge concerning a T-theory which you know, that it meets your further requirements, namely that it's been devised in the light of the principles of radical interpretation, and it's been tested in the light of the principles of charity and humanity. If you know all that about the theory, and if you know that theory entails that snow is white is true if no news snow is white, then indeed you do know enough for translation. But now this isn't a theory in the sense you envisaged, because although it's got the formal core which counts as a theory because it's got axioms and theorems and things, this extra, the material outside that theory that you have to know, the stuff you have to know about the theory, didn't belong with your kind of account, because it did make rather unrestrained use of notions of interpretation or translation or whatever. So that was the line of his criticism, and then there's a rather complex passage where he wonders whether you can get around this by using your paratactic account entails that. And that's why when you use the words I've just quoted, you say that if you had the extra theoretic knowledge, the knowledge about a theory, that would involve indexical elements, because you were going along with Foster's idea that you would probably treat I know that the theory entails that as in the paratactic method, and therefore it's involving indexicality. So, sorry, that was just giving the background.
Yeah.
Now, perhaps, should I try one more reading of the words again? I'm sorry.
No, please don't.
No, all right.
No, I say
Sure.
that because I'm not inclined to put whatever it is I now believe in those words.
Right. That would be more interesting. That's the point of my question, was to find out what your point of view is.
No, quite right. Well, let's see. Let me try to straighten out a couple of elementary things. I'm sure you're clear about them. Tarski didn't produce theories of truth.
Sure.
He produced definitions of truth for specific languages. And from just a technical point of view, it looks as though there's not much difference, because his definitions look exactly like a theory until you get to the very last stage, and then you turn what is sometimes called an implicit definition into an explicit one by a technical device that Frege and other people thought of, and this requires some higher level set theory and so on. Now, if you just subtract that last stage, that sounds like just a technical move, but there is this difference that the truth predicate is no longer defined. And so you can, if you want, regard it as a perfectly general but undefined concept, which you can use in characterizing truth in various languages. It'll be one concept which you then use to characterize languages, or as I would say, speakers. Now that's from the point of view of Tarski's technical interests. This would be a very regressive move, because it wouldn't show how to eliminate the truth predicate at all. It would suppose that we haven't said what it is, we've just said how it works. That is, we're putting it to work as a way of characterizing these languages. That's my interest, not Tarski's, and for very good reasons. I mean, we both have good reasons. They're just different. So the result is that I think of these theories, which just tell us how truth is distributed through some language, as empirical theories. That is, we can say, this actually describes more or less well how this person or this group of people speak. Now, ultimately, these theories, as I see them, are talking about utterances, not about sentences. And that's essential, certainly, if you're going to say anything sensible about indexical expressions, because the truth conditions of sentences with indexical expressions are going to differ according to the circumstances. It's also, of course, the case that if you're going to talk about the truth conditions of utterances, the so-called T-sentences, like the sentence "snow is white" is true if and only if snow is white, are not going to look the same way at all, because if utterances are the things we're talking about, we're going to have to say something like, if so-and-so, if Jones utters the sentence "snow is white," then his utterance is true if and only if, and so forth. And of course, since utterances have dates and so forth, what looked like a straightforward T-sentence in Tarski now becomes a universally quantified statement. It says, whenever this person utters this sentence, then if somebody, for any utterance of this sentence at any time T, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth, now it now has the form of a law, which it didn't have at all before. All right. Now, I think once one realizes that this has not only empirical, but that it has the form of a law, whereas in the kinds of languages that Tarski was concerned with, all he had to do was talk about sentences. It's now enough to say, if somebody knows what that T-sentence says, and he knows this for all the other things the person might utter, then that's all he needs to know in order to understand the person. And I don't think there's any point in and this is where I'm not pretending I'm repeating what I said in my answer to Foster. I don't think there's any point in saying, and he knows it's a law that does such and such work and so forth. If he knows that whenever this person utters this sentence, he's said something which is true or false under such and such conditions, then I know what he said.
But I suppose you wouldn't if it was just accidentally true. If one can imagine that being accidentally true. I mean, that's your point about saying.
Well, that's the difference between, that is this subtle thing about universally quantified statements may be true by accident rather than on purpose. And that is not something certainly that you put into the sentence itself. If somebody tells you that whenever you drop something in the gravitational field of the Earth, it's going to accelerate at such and such a, you don't add, and that's a law, right? You just say whenever this, that. And that's all you need to know in order to predict what things are going to do. And it's a whole it's not clear what that additional piece of information is.
It looks out as being an accident.
Well, so far as understanding the person, if you know that this is true of all that person's utterances, that of course includes all the future ones, right? So it was perhaps a mistake, not just perhaps, I'm inclined to think it was a mistake on my part to say, and you have to know that it's a law. Mm-hmm. But if somebody thinks you should add that, then this doesn't make this differ from the laws of physics or any other law. And I think what I said then, or what I would certainly say now, if we understand about the understanding of language, as well as we understand physics, we're all
Sure. But then, can I just follow that up then with it's really one thought, but expressed with two examples. One might put, I think you probably won't really like this way of putting it, but you might put the original difficulty that people like Foster found with the idea of truth theories in these terms, that the conditions for salva veritate substitution that are imposed just by the material biconditional are rather weaker than we would want or hope for from something that counted as a theory of meaning. Well, the reason I wanted to put in that terminology was that one might say exactly the same, even for a material conditional which, or a universally quantified material condition which has the form of a law. And the reason for thinking this is that whatever has the form of a law or amounts to, presumably one would expect the following to hold, that this, we might call this nomological necessity, and although you didn't want any kind of expression in the theory which would indicate the nomological status of the axioms and theorems of the theory, nonetheless one would expect the following to hold, that substitutions which would be permissible if there was such an explicit statement of nomological necessity would be permissible if there wasn't. And would also expect the following to hold, that substitutions that are permissible within for logical necessity will be permissible for nomological necessity, because intuitively nomological necessity is some sort of restriction on logical necessity. It just considers some of all the logically possible worlds. Well, there are at least two cases, and maybe this would get us into the kind of differences that we alluded to before, in which you arguably have substitutions that will produce unwanted results that will be permitted because they're permitted in logically necessary contexts, then a fortiori they'd be permitted in sentences having the form of laws. And one would be that of proper names, and the other would be that of provable equivalence. So just taking the proper name case, it would go like this. Supposing it had the form of a law that any utterance of Hesperus is phosphorus is true if and only if Hesperus is phosphorus, then that would be consistent with it actually being a consequence. Well, no, it would actually be a consequence of that, given that Hesperus is phosphorus, that any utterance of Hesperus is phosphorus is true if and only if Hesperus is Hesperus. And then that's giving you the uninterpretive, or arguably on some views, the uninterpretive kind of T-sentence. And then if you have, for example, that snow is white is provably equivalent to snow is white and it's raining or it's not, then again, since provable equivalent is substitutable in context of logical necessity, one would expect them to be substitutable in context of nomological necessity, and so one would again expect that even if it has the form of the law, that anyone who utters snow is white speaks truly just on condition that snow is white, then it also ought to be a law that anyone who utters snow is white speaks truly just on condition that snow is white and it's raining or it's not. So it looks as if some of the difficulties that bothered Foster would still be there, even when we take your point about laws.
Yes,
that was meant to end as a question.
Sure, no, it was. I'm not sure what the considerations about necessity, what role those play, but I mean, about that I would just say, rather than talk about necessity, nomological or otherwise, I'm more inclined to say, to the extent that as ordinary people we're coming to understand somebody or even pick up a first language, our expectations are based upon our ways of generalizing or reasoning inductively. Given what we've got so far, we expect it to go on in a certain way. We might be wrong, of course, and often are, but in the most basic situations, more often not. Because if that weren't the case, we would never learn anything at all. Of course, when we're, to the extent that we want to pretend that people are consciously cooking up a theory, they're going to put into their theory what they believe to be a genuine regularity. That is, that it will incorporate what they expect is going to happen. Now, whether there's something more to being a law than that, I don't know. But it seems to me, in a way, a mistake to get into that when what we're talking about is rather how these generalizations, which have been arrived at in normal inductive ways, are supposed to be understood. We understand them the way we understand what we call the laws of physics or biology or whatever it might be. As for these unwanted T-sentences, there I think it's enough to say when you're giving any empirical theory at all, you can always add on unnecessary consequences of the theory. They don't do any harm except that they make it look more complicated than there's any point in making it look. And I think I'm inclined to say that about the case of just adding on a logical truth to everything. We just see at once that you can take all that away and it won't make any difference, and so we better take it away. There are other cases that are more extreme, which people have suggested, which is, after all, if Snow is white is true, I mean, if it's true that Snow is white, then why isn't this a perfectly good T-sentence? The sentence, Snow is white, is true if and only if rabbits have tails, because that's true too, and so we've got this sentence. The biconditional is true. I mean, part of the answer is, of course, when we produce the theory of the kind I was talking about, is going to be universally quantified. But you might say, well, but still, it's true. And here, I think what you have to say is, but we have to fit in the truth, our account of the truth conditions of these sentences with the truth conditions of other sentences. And among those sentences will be ones like, that's a rabbit, or that's snow, or this is white. And we won't be able to fit those sentences in with the other ones and get into our theory. The sentence, snow is white, is true if and only if rabbits have tails. So it's once you get into the structure that you see that will be eliminated. And I think that's an answer to a lot of objections that people have made.
Although it must be said in Foster's defense that he was aware of that strategy, and so he tried to avoid, produce an objection that wouldn't be vulnerable to that point by envisaging the rot setting in at the level of the axioms, so the structural considerations were adhered to. So, and he would, and the sorts of examples he would use would be having, say, among your axioms for names, the name Hesperus denotes phosphorus instead of having the right one. And then he'd have as an axiom for white that something satisfies white just on condition that it's white and either it's raining or it's not, so that then this disease would be ground out quite properly up through the structure into the more complex sentences. And I guess that part of what I was concerned with in the previous question was whether you felt that strengthening the conception of a T-sentence beyond anything that Tarski has envisaged by lopping off the definitional part of Tarski and seeing something which could be regarded as having the form of a law, whether you felt it dealt with those objections, so the ones which seek to avoid the thought that structure will, the fact that we have to get everything right at once will help out. They seek to avoid that by getting the defective things in at the level of axioms rather than just envisaging them tacked on to the theorems. So does law-likeness stop one saying that, does a proper consideration of law-likeness stop one saying that it's perfectly good to have the axiom Hesperus denotes phosphorus, or perfectly good to have the axiom things satisfy white just on condition that they're white and it's raining or not?
Yes. No, this is a different case.
Right.
And I actually didn't remember that Foster brought that sort of case up, but it's certainly worth thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
My own view is that if you pursue this subject as I think it must be, namely basically on the individual level, that is, what I think about is how does one person understand another? And we'll see, as a practical matter, the theory of meaning that emerges as part of that project for one person is probably going to work more or less for the next person in the community. But if we go back to the basic situation of the individual, at the same time that you get a theory of meaning, you get a theory of what the person believes and what they want. Now, different people believe different things, and some people believe that Hesperus is phosphorus, and some people don't. And the theory of meaning in detail that you apply to one of these people should be different from the one that you apply to the other person, because you're connecting their use of sentences such as, that's Hesperus, with their behavior, what they point to, the circumstances under which they say it, and the implications they draw from it, and so forth. So you can, and sometimes do, discover that people don't know that the man next door is the president of the bank. And though you can't, in understanding what he's talking about, you better be sure not to suppose that you can substitute one of those expressions for the other. The same for Hesperus and phosphorus. This person who doesn't know that they're the same will use them in these words in different situations. And if you want to give a correct account of both what he means and what he says, you're going to have to introduce two words, even if you have to invent one, in order to keep distinct. I mean, you might have only one word. You might just have Venus and not have Hesperus and phosphorus. And now you want to understand this person who, in his vocabulary, he's got 2 or even 3 names for the same thing. You will have to invent something, or put on subscripts or whatever. But really inventing a new word, which of course you can understand and explain perfectly well. But you can do that not just by saying what the word denotes, but also because it's part of the theory of his beliefs. You'll see that he believes some things, expresses some beliefs using the word Hesperus and other different beliefs using the word phosphorus. So I think you could get into a lot of trouble if you're taking this sort of Fregean view of language as something that's sitting there and we're assigning references and meanings and so forth. But if what we see ourselves doing is necessarily getting an account both of what the person believes and what he means at the same time, then we won't have trouble with that.
Can I just clarify something, what you said about Hesperus and phosphorus, because I may have just misheard, misunderstood. Was it a consequence of what you said that the person who believes that Hesperus is phosphorus and is willing to assert it uses his words differently from one who does not believe this and therefore who is willing to assert the negation? I mean, uses his words differently in a sense that's relevant to the construction of an appropriate theory of interpretation.
Yes, because he'll express some beliefs using Hesperus and others using phosphorus, and these beliefs won't be the same ones. I mean, he won't believe the same things when he says one and when he says the other. These will be different beliefs for him. And that's why we can't catch how he is using words. That is, in some rough sense of meaning, what he means by those words. We can't catch it if we substitute just Hesperus for both his Hesperus and his phosphorus.
Sure, but when he comes to know that Hesperus is phosphorus, will the sentence in his mouth, Hesperus is visible, just express the same belief as the sentence in his mouth, phosphorus is visible?
Yeah.
Because that's quite a, it sounds like a point of detail, but
yes.
It's actually a rather significant point from the point of view of how you view the relation between language and fact. Because here's an alternative view. Frege's view was that whether you know that Hesperus is phosphorus, the sentence phosphorus is visible is going to express one thought, and the sentence Hesperus is visible is going to express another. And so when you come to learn the identity, there's no change in what senses your words express.
Yes.
Language rolls on the same, And what you've alluded to is a change in just what one believes and not a change in language. Whereas on your view, there's actually a change at the level of language. So I did just want, if that is your view, I just wanted really to stress that, just to bring that out.
Yes, no, I'm glad you do, because I would like to think that a very large point, part of the point of my project is to get rid of the puzzles that we get into if we think of meanings as fixed entities of some sort. The whole idea is to explain people's behavior, linguistic and otherwise, without using the word meaning. I mean, once we've explained it, we can now talk about meaning because we know what we're talking about, one might say.
Yeah.
But meanings haven't played any role in the explanation. So the idea is how do people actually use words? I think much of the discussion of names looks very different if you approach it as I'm suggesting. I mean, I don't want to say Mill was right, proper names don't have a meaning. I don't want to say Frege was right to do it his way. I'm coming at it really from a somewhat different angle that looks more directly at individual use of words.
So perhaps one of the shibboleths that your approach would try to undermine would be the thought that there is a single anything that's in common between all users of the same name, for example. So whether it's a single referent, as in the case of Mill, or a single sense, as in the case of Frege. You at least wouldn't want to enter the project radical interpretation with any assumption of that.
That's absolutely right.
Right.